All right. Absolutely a wrong slide entirely, which doesn't help us. Right. Welcome, everyone, to this second virtual residency of the Low Carbon Institute, which is an umbrella term for a whole bunch of year-long activities. My name is Alex. I am the initiator of this adventure, and this is actually our first talk, which is amazing. We are kicking off with Louise Harling from the Carbon Literacy Project. A little bit about Louise to get us started, and I will hand over to Louise for her to share her slides right after. Louise is a certified carbon literacy trainer and has experience in both the development and delivery of carbon literacy materials across a range of audiences. Her experience delivering training to students allowed her to build upon communication and teaching skills while also maintaining a strong peer-to-peer connection with learners. Since working for the Carbon Literacy Project itself, Louise has been involved in the development of a range of different educational toolkits across a variety of sectors, and will be sharing lessons from those. And so I'm really grateful for your time, Louise. So looking forward to this, and we'll hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Alex. Yeah, thank you for having us. It's really lovely to be back with you guys. I know a colleague of mine had to step in for me last minute on the last occasion because I was awfully sick. So it's nice to actually finally be here. And yeah, nice to kick things off as the first talk as well. So I'll just share my slides. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to spend a bit of time talking about who we are and what we do, and then kind of the lessons and tools which I've picked up as a result of working with the project for the last 2.5 years, I think it's been. So usually my role focuses around the healthcare sector and blue light and coordinating all of our NHS work, but I'm not really going to focus on that too much today because it's not overly relevant. So it's quite nice to be doing something slightly different. But like I said in that little bio, a lot of what I do is focusing around the development of learning materials and education materials, and kind of how to communicate climate change, which yeah is much more difficult than we first initiated. So to kick us off, what actually is carbon literacy? What is this project? What do we do on a daily basis? We'll give you a good understanding of what skills can be developed from that. So essentially, carbon literacy is an awareness of the carbon costs and impacts of everyday activities, and then the ability and motivation to reduce emissions on an individual, community, and an organizational basis. So quite broad in its definition. But we focus on a few kind of key areas, and those are the learning method, climate knowledge, values, and then action. So carbon literacy training is essentially a day's worth of climate education, where individuals leave feeling like they've gained the knowledge, but also they're empowered to take action on climate change as well. So like I said, 1 day's worth of learning. The learning is always local to the individuals who are receiving it. So whether that's being delivered to, you guys at the Design Institute, or whether it's being delivered to the areas that I usually work in, NHS, it will vary depending on who the audience is. So making sure that whoever's receiving that education can relate to it in a way which makes sense to them and their environment is really, really important. It's usually, and we try to encourage the delivery of carbon literacy training by peers, because it's all good and well having someone external come in and talk to us about climate education and climate change, but it is most effective when it comes from individuals who you can relate to, who are like yourself, who have an understanding of your background and what it means to you. Group inquiry is a really important element of training as well, because you learn well when you're with peers and individuals who you can relate to, you can explore topics with, you can have discussions with, and positivity is also massively important. It can be a really heavy topic, therefore communicating in a way which is positive and inspiring and leaves people feeling engaged and empowered is really, really important too. Knowledge, so the knowledge that you gain on a carbon literacy course what climate change is, the impacts that that is having on a global scale, but also on a local scale as well. So that could be in your town, in your city, it could be in your organization, it could be in your department. It really can go as individual down to, you know, the smaller groups as well. What policies are taking place to tackle climate change? Again, that can be on an international scale, or it can be right down to an organizational scale, department scale as well. So looking at kind of, you know, the bigger picture, but also honing in on your role within that as well. Carbon footprints, what they are, what they mean as individuals, but also as organizations, and the roles which we play in those footprints, and actions that we can take in order to reduce those emissions. Again, large scale, small scale stuff, and how to talk about climate action, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail a bit later on in that kind of communication aspect. But the values that carbon literacy focus on is that actions of individuals and collective actions do make a difference, and actually we need to be working as a collective in taking individual action, but also working with teammates, with peers, with colleagues, with other students in order to make that change is really, really important. Another thing that we really focus on is the kind of benefits of climate action, not just for the environment, but for other areas in life as well. So, you know, how that can lead to a better world, and actually how that's better for financially, for our pockets, for our societies, for our communities, and, you know, all those other benefits that we can see as a result of taking climate action. Looks at equity and fairness, so that's both now and historically, and also in the future as well. So, you know, looking at how we can make sure that those kind of who have produced lots of emissions are taking responsibility in order to reduce them, whether that's not presently right now and whether that's been in the past. So one example we always use of this is the project is mainly based in Manchester, and Manchester was a huge city for the cotton industry and the Industrial Revolution. Therefore, even though it's on a really good track for low carbon advancements and movements now, historically we've got a lot of work to do. And training, it's also important to acknowledge that for people who are talking about climate change and talking about environment issues and carbon can often come with a lot of emotional content as well, because it is quite an emotional topic. And we're seeing that more and more with the growth of, you know, climate anxiety and, you know, how that's being discussed more and more. And so it's really important to consider that in carbon literacy delivery as well. So training ends on actions, so it ends on a positive note. So as a result of your day's worth of climate education, what are you going to do as a result to take climate action and reduce your emissions? So that's an individual action. What am I going to do on my own as an individual? But also a group action as well. So with my peers, with my family, with my department, what am I going to do? What am I going to encourage? What am I going to roll out? So those actions should be taken in the context of where the training is being delivered. So if that's being delivered at work, then we'd want workplace actions. If it's being delivered in the community, then maybe we'd look more so at home-based actions. So we don't actually deliver any of the training ourselves, but we support organisations to deliver their own carbon literacy training schemes. So individuals will often write their own courses, submit them for us for an accreditation, and then we kind of act as the accreditation and facilitation body that sits behind it. So at the end of each training session, those action pledges that I mentioned in the previous slide, they are collected up from learners and they're submitted over to us, and we make sure that individuals have submitted appropriate action pledges. And sometimes it's that we want people to maximise their influence a little bit more, or we feel like they could be doing a little bit more. And so we might have to go back to learners and discuss their action pledges with them. It's just to try and get everybody involved in something that's going to be as impactful as possible. So these are some of the statistics of organisations that we've worked with. So we've actually, I think this morning, just hit 35,000 citizens who have been certified as carbon literate. We can't actually, it's not possible for us to keep the graphics up to date based on how much training we do. So now we're doing monthly updates instead of just trying to hit every single target. So I think, well, a colleague posted this graphic, I think it was 2 days ago, saying this is the most up-to-date one, up-to-date all your materials. And yeah, like I said, this morning we hit 35, so yeah, that's great. So yeah, like I said, over 3,000 organisations are involved. You can see how many action pledges have been made there. So we have over 350 different courses that have been designed as well. Almost 100 carbon literate organisations across 12 different sectors in 17 different nations. So this kind of gives you an idea of the scale of what we do and who's actually involved. You can also see the little spanner at the bottom, which talks about toolkits. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on those sector toolkits and involvement in those and lessons learned from that as well. So I've just quickly flipped through all these logos again to give you a bit of an idea of scale. So these are all of the local authorities and regional governments that we've worked with. These are all of the universities that we've worked with. We've got all of the NHS organisations that we work with. That's kind of my remit. All the community groups that we've worked in, might recognise some of these depending on where you're based, and then a load of other organisations that we also do a lot of work with. So that just gives you some idea about, who is this appropriate for? Everyone, everyone can be doing this and getting involved in this. So I touched on the idea of toolkit approaches, and we, about 2.5 years ago now, we had some funding come through from the Department for Bays from the government. And what we realized is that in a lot of sectors, there just isn't the resources or the time for sector individuals to develop their own materials, carbon literacy materials, to be able to run their day's worth of training. So what we did is we started to develop toolkits, and what they are is they are packages which different sectors can use in order to run their own carbon literacy training. So they're as close to off-the-shelf materials which you can get essentially, and that's something that I've been quite heavily involved with my work. So they're specific for the sector, they're adaptable. So again, and that local learning, which is really important, can be adapted. Of course, materials can be adapted in order to make it localized to the learners. They're a complete kit, and essentially they allow anyone within that sector to be able to deliver training. So some of the benefits of that include, saving time and costs on getting those materials accredited. It kind of creates a uniform approach for training across the sector as well. And it also, really ramps up the speed at which carbon literacy can be picked up in a sector. So this will become relevant when I go into it in a little bit more detail. So these are all of the sector toolkits that we have developed. And again, like I mentioned, the development of those course materials I've been quite heavily involved with from the get-go, from our first toolkit from local authorities through to the healthcare toolkits as well, which we have available. So what does a toolkit actually include? Like what actually is it? So essentially, these are materials which include a trainer manual. So that's a speaker manual, a bit of a script. You've also got a slide deck as well, and then an activity pack. So that focuses on how to engage individuals and actually making sure that training is interactive and interesting and engaging, and that communication is strong because it interacts people and it's not just being spoken out for a long period of time. So you also get some resources support and some getting started documents as well. So that's kind of what a toolkit is, but it allows organisations to deliver that day's worth of climate education, and it's split up into sizable chunks which can then be delivered either online or in a face-to-face format. So those materials really kind of support the delivery of kind of carbon literacy. And I wanted to talk at this point, now you've got a bit of a background about who we are and what we do, about that kind of communication aspect, because engaging individuals in the climate crisis and in kind of low carbon initiatives and, climate action can be a difficult topic to approach, because it is very sensitive for a lot of people, and it does need to be kind of made adaptable and made interesting for the individuals who are receiving the training. And what we learn a lot of from producing the toolkits is that every audience is different, and how you engage your audience will depend on how they are used to engaging. So, for example, a lot of the development work that we do is looking at things like IPCC documents, legal documentation, climate science records, things like that. and looking at the content that is actually in them and how we want to communicate that to individuals and what those individuals' backgrounds are. So looking at those really important and actually quite difficult to understand policy documents and turning them into things which are interesting and engaging. So in the activity pack that we use a lot of games. So we have flashcards, we have things that you can type into boxes and kind of tick box. We also have animated slides where different points come up in different areas. So that kind of engagement thing is not just speaking at people for a long period of time, which I think is so easy for people to just turn off at that point and to, you know, disengage with it, especially when it's a really hard hitting topic as well, and especially when it's difficult information that is being communicated. But yeah, that engagement is super, super important, and thinking about how the audience usually engages with things. So for example, if you're working with a creative audience, it's quite likely that the materials that you're going to need to use need to be engaging and look nice and interactive in themselves. Whereas if you're working, you know, if we're working with a really corporate audience, or, you know, I work with medical audiences a lot, then it's going to look completely different because those audiences are used to seeing different types of materials. So depending on who you're delivering to really needs to, what your approach is really needs to change. If the trainer is delivering to a community group, or, you know, I'm imagining like a community garden group or something, then, you know, they're going to be much more animated and elated and, you know, interesting in the way they talk, and not so formal and more open. Whereas if you're, delivering in an office block full of individuals who are used to working in an office, then you're going to be a lot more kind of calmer in your approach and a lot more formal and professional. So I think it really depends on the audience, that is there and that is in play, and how they engage best with difficult topics. And you have to be prepared that, you know, you could get a reaction to a difficult topic as well, and, you know, it is an emotive thing to be learning about, and trainers need to be kind of aware of that. So these are some of the slides which are taken from the toolkits, which just go through kind of how's best to talk to people about climate change and how's best to communicate people about climate change. So some of the things there: find a value that you have in common. So like thinking about the audience, how do they engage well, you know, what is it that they care about in their day-to-day lives that you can maybe use in order to deliver that information. Connect that to a story, so using kind of personal anecdotes as well, especially, you know, and that's the same across all different sectors and all different audiences, but actually we're not all perfect, and telling your personal stories about things and journeys that you've been on and things that you've done can really help and can really support in the delivery of information and communications as well. Inspiring practical and attractive solutions, so kind of going back to that, focusing on sort of co-benefits and what else we can see as a result of you know, doing climate action and making changes and reducing emissions. That approach of, you know, we can see better communities and we can see better environments for our children, and, you know, for example, more cycle paths, you know, that's not only reducing emissions and reducing the amount of cars on the road, but it's also good for spending time with our family when we drop our kids off at school, and it's also good for our mental health and for our physical health, you know, because we're out and about and we're cycling a bit more. So inspiring those kind of attractive solutions can be a really good thing to focus on. Second one is finding some common ground. So thinking about those shared common interests and how that kind of makes people drive to want to be better. So this example here focuses on the fumes from all the vehicles that are on the road and the buses and large vehicles, and actually, you know, someone saying, well, I want to know how that's affecting my health and how that's affecting my children's health. And, you know, we all have that as a shared common interest, because, you know, we all have an interest in being healthy. So, you know, finding that common ground when we're making those communications as well. And, you know, for a creative audience, that can absolutely be applied, because there's always going to be that common ground which people believe in. Therefore, you know, finding out what that is and understanding your audience and what they're interested in and what engages them is kind of the first step to developing that engaging content and material. So yeah, really important point there. So we kind of briefly spoke about stories, but yeah, like I said, engaging those stories, that storytelling aspect. I think people engage with things when they feel really human and really personal to them. So this example, you know, is looking at bad air pollution, and how, you know, this individual has started cycling to work because it's better for rush hour traffic, and it saves them money, and it's about kind of, yeah, encouraging that storytelling within your communications, and that personal aspect of things, which is really useful. Some of the common pitfalls that we often see in those kind of communications, scare tactics. So that's, you know, never really works or never really engages people to the maximum that they could be if you're just focusing on the really scary stuff. And a lot of our training walks you through kind of climate science, and we use a film called the David Attenborough Climate Change the Facts documentary. If you haven't watched it, you should go away, YouTube it, definitely watch it, because it's really, really empowering tool. But it is quite a scary documentary, and sometimes it can leave people feeling a little bit immobilized and not entirely sure where to start with their journey and how to make a positive input. So it's really important to focus on the positive side of things and the other benefits that we can see, rather than just saying, this is really bad, this is really scary, you know, we're all going to die. That's not an effective way to communicate. So keeping things positive, you know, being honest about the truth and what's going on, but keeping things positive is really important. Every little helps. So there's this real discourse in the kind of environmental and low carbon sector at the minute of, you know, things such as reducing plastic consumption, not using plastic bags, having our coffee cups, you know, not having straws. And they are all really, really good things to be focusing on and to be doing, but they should just be things that we're doing anyway. And, you know, just because we are, you know, not, you know, taking our reusable coffee cup to work and, you know, taking a packed lunch and reducing plastic, there's still things that we should be doing. But actually, in the big schemes of impacts that we could be having in order to reduce emissions, those little things aren't going to make a huge amount of change. So it's important to, you know, address that and talk about them, but also know that, you know, it's more of taking steps in order to get us to a better place, and those smaller steps can lead to bigger steps, but that, yeah, they shouldn't kind of be the only focus. And we see it all the time working in, you know, things related to waste, and people, you know, maybe driving 45 minutes to get to work when they could take a bus or a train or could cycle, and that's a really effective way to significantly reduce emissions, but they're using their coffee cup, so that's okay. So you can kind of see where that discourse lies, and it can be quite a difficult sticking point for that communication, definitely. And overloading people with information, I think definitely reducing, you know, things like reducing text. So on a lot of our slides, it's not really text heavy, it's just got the main points on there, and then we can talk about, or ask trainers to talk about the information rather than just trying to kind of overload people with text. But, you know, think about what you're communicating and to what audience, and focus on, you know, the key points that you want to get across, rather than trying to get it all across, if that makes sense. So there's just an example of that there. Quite often this kind of thing can feel really distant. So, you know, we don't use any polar bears in any of our communications at all. It's really outdated. It just doesn't really get people anymore. A cute fluffy polar bear, maybe for children, perhaps, you know, if they're cute, and that might get through. But, you know, it needs to make sense to you, and, you know, the people who we're delivering to, especially like if it's UK based, they don't relate to polar bears. So there's not much use in using them. So, you know, try not to make it feel really distant in your communications, and try and make it feel like it makes sense to the individual who's receiving it. So, you know, for example, this picture here, which uses more local examples of a pub. I think that's a pub in Shrewsbury, which, yeah, got flooded. So that kind of making it local to the individual who is receiving it is really important. So this is another really key thing. This isn't actually our resource, but in terms of kind of communicating to audiences, we find imagery to be a really, really important part of that. And there's this excellent organization called Climate Outreach who we use a lot and who have some really, really good resources on what kind of imagery can be used in order to effectively communicate climate change. So I'll just take you through some of their kind of core principles and talk a little bit about them. And then I'll just quickly show you their website, because it is a really, really great resource that, yeah, I'm a big fan of. And we use a lot in our materials creation. I just thought it might be of some use. So they kind of come up with these core principles for communicating climate crisis. One of those is showing real people. So we do often use kind of animated and sketched images in our training materials, like you saw in those previous slides. And they're quite good for illustrating an idea of the future or how we should be doing things. Whereas if you're talking about real scenarios and real situations, try and use real people so that people can view it and, like I said, relate to it and it makes sense to them. So they've got a collection of, they've pulled together a collection of images and photographs which look at real people globally across the world and how they're impacted by climate change and how they're creating solutions to climate change. And yeah, showing that kind of real person element can really kind of, evoke some emotions in individuals and really drive people to make that change because they can relate to them and it makes sense to them. This is something that could be happening to me. Therefore, I want to make this better and make those changes. So showing real people is one of them. Telling new stories, like I mentioned about the polar bears, we don't want to be retelling stories that have been told over and over again, and actually focusing on the stories which have values which the audience relate to is really, really important. Showing climate change causes at scale, so showing the mass impact of that rather than just focusing. It's important to focus on the individual and to localize the issue, but we also need to be making individuals aware of the the impact on a larger scale and on the global scale as well is really important. Showing emotionally powerful impacts as well, so how that is affecting on people's emotions and on people's health and on people's mental well-being and things like that. And these are all principles which Climate Visuals do have images for on their website. Understanding your audience, again, something that we focus on massively in terms of how we develop different sector toolkits, understanding about what drives them, what values they have, and what's gonna make sense to them in their remit as well in receiving that training. Showing local but also serious impacts, so talking about extreme weather events that have happened in your local area, talking about the floods that are going on, the storms that are happening, things that people can remember and recall, the issues that they experienced as a result of that, the power cuts, the road closures, things like that, and bringing it kind of home to the individuals. They've also got another point there, which is be careful with protest imagery, because it can be, again, it's important to show kind of emotive imagery, but protest imagery can sometimes, and we have experienced this with trainers who have delivered training, you don't want to make it too political, and that can sometimes be a sticking point for people as well. So this is the Climate Visuals Library. So I'll just quickly come off my screen share and share my screen onto this here. So what you can actually do on the Climate Visuals Library, hopefully just give me a nod, Alex, if that's shared on the right thing. Yeah, perfect. So what you can do is they have a selection of all of these different images and you can essentially search terms in there. And it will come up with images that you can use in order to communicate things to people, and all of those kind of key principles that we talked about are kind of all on here. So at the project we only use Creative Commons images, and it might be that if you're pulling materials together, essentially they're free to use and you don't have to pay for them. So they've got all of these different kind of tick boxes which you can make sure, like, if you want to represent individuals in a specific country, or if you want to look at the solutions to a climate crisis or the impacts, or the causes, you can select all of these different things. And I just we have found in kind of developing resources for different audiences, this to be a really, really useful tool, because there's some really great images on here. One of the photographers, and his name's Toby Smith, and he's done a really, really great job of pulling this together, and he works for climate outreach. But I just think it's got some really kind of inspiring, quite heavy hitting imagery as well. But you can kind of just see the, you know, the array of different images from different places across the world. And I think that the imagery that we're using to communicate this is so important in engaging people, and, you know, making sure that we're doing that on a good scale is super, super important. So I just thought that was a really good, it's a really great tool that we use in a lot of our material development. And I just thought it was, yeah, something really, really interesting and worth sharing. So if you just Google climate visuals, then that will all come up. That is about it from me today. Unless you guys have any questions or discussion points or anything, then yeah, I'm happy to kind of hang around and talk about anything else if you guys have got any comments or anything.